The smell hits you first. Not crisp pine needles or campfire smoke promised in the brochures, but sour sweat, old rust, and the sharp chemical tang of ammonia cutting through the damp Oregon woods. When a 12-year-old kid finds a terrified girl tied up in an abandoned hunting blind, the rules of survival change. He didn't want to be a hero, but when over 100 Hell's Angels rumble up the mountain, heroism isn't a choice anymore. Situation report: the Cascade Foothills. Before Tayson stepped off the trail, the margin for error was already razor thin. Factor current state temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping rapidly toward freezing. Visibility low, heavy overcast canopy with fading afternoon light. Terrain slick mud. Dense blackberry bramble, rotting deadfalls. Tayson's equipment on hand. Standard issue canvas scout backpack, heavy, poorly packed. One dull faux bone pocket knife. A cracked plastic compass. A plastic emergency whistle. Tayson adjusted the strap of his canvas backpack. It dug directly into his collarbone, a sharp, persistent ache that mirrored the dull throb in his lower back. The forest wasn't magical. It was just wet. Water dripped from the canopy in heavy, irregular plops, striking the nylon shoulders of his windbreaker with the sound of snapping fingers. He hated the woods. He hated the forced march of Troop 44, the performative enthusiasm of Scoutmaster Hayes, and the way the damp cold seeped into his cheap hiking boots, turning his socks into freezing, abrasive sponges. He was lost. Not completely, but enough that the hollow pit in his stomach had started to expand. He had wandered off the trail to relieve himself, embarrassed by the lack of privacy among the other boys, and had taken a wrong turn on the way back. The towering Douglas firs all looked identical. Bark stripped gray, lichen clinging like pale green scabs to the trunks. He stopped. The silence out here wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against his eardrums. A raven croaked somewhere high above, the sound sharp and metallic. Tayson shivered. He wiped his nose on the back of his sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt and mucus on the green fabric. He pulled his compass from his pocket. The plastic casing was cracked. The needle shivered, pointing north, but north meant nothing to him without the trail. Then the air shifted. The wind changed direction, bringing with it a smell that didn't belong in the loam and decaying leaves. It smelled like garbage, hot, sweet garbage mixed with the stark, stinging odor of battery acid and unwashed hair. Tayson gagged. He took a step back, his heel catching on a thick root. He stumbled, catching himself with a hand against a tree trunk. The bark was rough, peeling away in wet, pulpy strips. He looked toward the source of the smell. Through a dense thicket of blackberry brambles, the gray, rotting wood of a structure broke the natural pattern of the forest. It wasn't a cabin. It was an old, collapsed logging shack. The roof had caved in on one side, covered in a thick blanket of moss that made it look like a tumor growing out of the earth. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at him to run the other way, to blindly crash through the brush until he hit the logging road. But the boy didn't move. He stood there, his breath pluming in the cold air, listening. A sound drifted from the shack. It wasn't an animal. Animals rustled, they snapped twigs, they grunted. This was a metallic clink, a rhythmic, desperate scraping of metal against metal. Clink, drag, clink. Tayson's heart kicked against his sternum, hard. It actually hurt. He felt a sudden sharp urge to urinate again. He swallowed, his throat completely dry despite the dampness of the world around him. He unclipped the whistle from his chest strap, wrapping his cold white fingers around the plastic peel. He didn't blow it. If he blew it, whatever was making that sound would know he was there. He took a step forward. The wet ground muffled his boots. He pushed through the brambles, the thorns catching his nylon pants, tearing a small, jagged hole near his knee. He didn't feel it. His eyes were locked on the gaping black hole where the shack's door used to be. The smell grew thicker. It coated the back of his tongue. He pressed his back against the side of the shack. The wood was spongy and cold. He slid sideways, holding his breath until his lungs burned, and peeked around the doorframe. The inside of the shack was dim, lit only by the weak gray light filtering through the collapsed roof. Dust motes danced in the pale beams. In the corner, slumped against a rusted cast-iron wood stove, was a man. He was asleep or dead. Tayson couldn't tell. The man's mouth was hanging open, a thick line of drool connecting his cracked lips to the filthy collar of a denim jacket. A glass pipe lay on the dirt floor near his twitching, muddy boots. But the man wasn't making the sound. On the opposite side of the room, chained to a thick, exposed pipe that ran into the dirt, was a girl. She looked younger than Tayson, 9, maybe 10. Her hair was a matted rat's nest of blonde and dirt. She was wearing a pink t-shirt that was torn at the shoulder, stained with dark brown patches. She was sitting in the dirt, her knees pulled to her chest. Her ankle was bound by a thick, heavy dog chain, the metal biting into her bruised skin. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. She was scraping the chain against the pipe, over and over. Clink, drag. Tayson couldn't breathe. The air in the shack was suffocating. He stared at her, and slowly her head turned. Her eyes were wide, the whites completely bloodshot. She didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She just stared at him with a look of absolute, hollow terror. It wasn't the look of a child. It was the look of a hunted animal that knew the trap was about to spring. Tayson stood frozen in the doorway. He wanted his mom. He wanted his annoying older brother. He wanted to be sitting at his kitchen table eating dry cereal, ignoring his homework. He did not want to be here. His legs felt like they had turned to water. He physically tried to step backward, but his boots felt bolted to the mud. The girl's eyes locked onto his. She stopped scraping the chain. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wet, rattling snores of the man in the corner. Tayson swallowed hard. It felt like swallowing a golf ball. He raised a trembling hand, putting a finger to his lips. Shh. It was a stupid, pointless gesture. She wasn't making any noise anyway. He stepped into the shack. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Tayson froze, his eyes darting to the sleeping man. The man snorted, shifted his weight, and scratched at his neck, murmuring something unintelligible. The smell of stale beer and unwashed skin radiated from him like heat from a radiator. Tayson waited, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, stinging his eyes. 10 seconds passed. The man settled back into a deep, rhythmic snore. Tayson moved toward the girl. Up close, she looked worse. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears. There was a purplish-yellow bruise blooming across her left cheekbone. Her hands were bound together with a thick, white zip tie. He crouched beside her. His knees popped loudly in the quiet room. He winced. The girl shrank back against the wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She smelled of urine and sheer terror. "I'm Tayson," he whispered. His voice cracked. It sounded pathetically small. "I'm a Boy Scout." He pointed to the patch on his shoulder, an absurd appeal to authority in the middle of a nightmare. She didn't care about the patch. She just stared at his hands. Tayson reached into his pocket and pulled out his folding knife. It wasn't a tactical survival blade. It had a faux bone handle and a blade he used mostly for whittling poorly shaped sticks. He fumbled to open it, his thumbnail slipping off the groove twice before he finally snapped it into place. The click echoed off the wooden walls. He reached for her bound hands. She flinched, pulling away violently. "Stop," Tayson hissed, his voice trembling with frustration and fear. "I have to cut it." He grabbed her wrists. Her skin was freezing, clammy to the touch. She fought him weakly, but he held on. He slipped the dull edge of the blade under the thick plastic zip tie. It was tight, too tight. The plastic dug into her skin, leaving a raw red indentation. Tayson sawed at the plastic. It barely yielded. The knife was practically useless. His knuckles brushed against her skin, and he felt her pulse hammering wildly. He pressed harder, gritting his teeth. His hand slipped. The blade sliced into the fleshy part of his own thumb. Tayson bit down on his lip to keep from crying out. The metallic taste of copper flooded his mouth. He sucked in a sharp breath through his nose, blinking back hot tears. He didn't look at his thumb. He just adjusted his grip and started sawing again. Snap. The plastic finally gave way. The girl pulled her hands apart, rubbing her raw wrists. "Okay," Tayson whispered, his voice shaky. "Okay, the chain." He looked at her ankle. The padlock securing the chain was thick, heavy brass. There was no way he was cutting through that with a pocket knife. He looked around the floor. Dirt, broken glass, an empty shell casing. No key. He looked at the sleeping man. The man's denim jacket had deep pockets. Tayson felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He couldn't do it. He couldn't walk over there and dig through that monster's pockets. What if he woke up? What if he grabbed him? Tayson was 12. He was scrawny. He couldn't fight a grown man. He looked back at the girl. She was watching him, reading his hesitation. The absolute hopelessness in her eyes hit him like a physical blow. She expected him to leave her. People probably left her a lot. Tayson wiped his bleeding thumb on his pants. He stood up. His legs shook so violently he had to lock his knees. He crept toward the corner. The smell of ammonia grew unbearable. The floorboards were slick with something he didn't want to identify. He stood over the man. The man's face was greasy, his skin pale and pockmarked. A large, jagged scar ran from his ear to his collarbone. Tayson reached out. His hand hovered over the breast pocket of the denim jacket. His fingers brushed the coarse fabric. The man twitched. Tayson froze. His breath caught in his throat. The man just scratched his nose and exhaled heavily. Tayson slid his fingers into the right side pocket. Gum wrappers, a lighter, no key. He moved to the left pocket. He slid his hand in, cold metal. He gripped it, a small, jagged key attached to a ring. He pulled it out just as the man shifted, rolling slightly onto his side. The man's heavy arm flopped over, landing directly onto Tayson's boot. Tayson stopped breathing. The weight of the man's arm pinned his foot to the floor. The man's eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his throat. Tayson didn't think. He didn't plan. He just reacted. He violently jerked his foot backward, slipping completely out of his muddy boot. The man grunted, swatting at the air where Tayson had been standing, but didn't open his eyes. He settled back into the dirt, burying his face into his collar. Tayson stood there, wearing one boot and one wet, muddy sock. He clutched the key so tightly it bit into his palm. He limped back to the girl. He knelt, jammed the key into the padlock, and turned it. It clicked. The lock popped open. The heavy chain fell away into the dirt with a dull thud. The girl immediately scrambled backward, pulling her knees to her chest. "Come on," Tayson mouthed. He grabbed his backpack, ignoring his abandoned boot. He didn't care. He just needed to be out of this smell. Out of this shack. He grabbed her hand. It felt like holding a bundle of cold twigs. He pulled her toward the doorway. They stepped out into the damp, gray afternoon. The cold air hit Tayson's face, clearing the stench of the cabin from his nose. He took a deep breath, his lungs expanding. Then, from inside the shack, a voice roared. "Where are you?" The scream tore through the damp silence of the woods. It wasn't just angry, it was feral. Tayson didn't look back. The paralyzing fear from earlier vanished, replaced by a sudden electric surge of pure adrenaline. "Run!" he hissed. He dragged the girl by her wrist, plunging straight into the thickest part of the blackberry brambles. The thorns tore at his nylon jacket, slicing across the exposed skin of his face and neck. He didn't feel it. He felt nothing but the frantic pounding rhythm of his own pulse. The girl stumbled beside him. She was barefoot, her small feet slipping on the wet moss and jagged rocks. She let out a sharp cry as a branch whipped back and caught her in the shoulder, but she didn't stop moving. Behind them, the shack's rotting doorframe splintered with a deafening crack. "I'll kill you!" the man screamed. The sound of heavy, stomping boots hit the earth. Tayson pushed harder. His missing boot made his gait uneven. His left foot, clad only in a soaked wool sock, slammed into unseen roots and sharp stones, sending spikes of pain shooting up his leg with every step. They ran blindly. The forest was a chaotic blur of gray trunks and dark green ferns. Tayson didn't know where the trail was. He didn't care. Downhill. Downhill usually meant water, and water eventually meant a road. That was something he learned in a scout meeting he had barely paid attention to. He heard the man crashing through the brush behind them. The man was big, heavy, and angry. He sounded like a bulldozer tearing through the undergrowth. "Keep going," Tayson gasped, his lungs burning. The cold air felt like shards of glass in his chest. The girl was dragging now, her weight pulling on his arm. She was exhausted, malnourished, and her bare feet were leaving bloody footprints on the wet stones. "I can't," she whimpered, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. It was the first time she had spoken. "You have to," Tayson said, pulling her forward. They crested a small ridge, and the ground dropped out beneath them. A steep, muddy embankment slid down into a narrow ravine. A shallow, fast-moving creek cut through the bottom, choked with deadfalls and smooth, slick rocks. Tayson didn't hesitate. He grabbed the girl's waist and jumped. They hit the mud and slid. It wasn't a graceful descent. Tayson tumbled backward, his backpack absorbing the worst of the impact as he scraped against rocks and exposed roots. The girl slid beside him, crying out as she hit a thick patch of briars. They splashed into the icy water of the creek. The cold was a physical shock, driving the breath from Tayson's lungs. His wet sock was instantly coated in freezing mud. He scrambled to his feet, pulling the girl up with him. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. She looked completely broken. "Up there," Tayson pointed to the opposite bank. There was a massive, ancient cedar tree that had been uprooted years ago in a storm. Its root system formed a towering, tangled wall of dirt and wood, creating a deep, dark hollow underneath the trunk. He shoved her up the bank. She scrambled on all fours, her fingers digging into the mud. Tayson followed, his socked foot slipping twice before he managed to drag himself over the edge. They crawled under the massive root system. The earth smelled rich and dense, a stark contrast to the chemical stench of the shack. The hollow was small, barely large enough for the two of them. Tayson pressed the girl against the back of the dirt wall and curled his body in front of hers, trying to make himself as small as possible. He clamped a muddy hand over her mouth. She didn't fight him. She just squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners and cutting tracks through the grime on her face. They waited. The sound of the man crashing through the woods grew louder. He was at the top of the ridge now. Tayson held his breath until his vision swam with black spots. He pressed his face into the wet dirt. "Ah, I know you're down there," the man screamed. His voice was raw, echoing down the ravine. The sound of rocks tumbling down the embankment followed. He was sliding down. Tayson squeezed his eyes shut. His hand holding the girl's mouth was trembling violently. He gripped his cheap folding knife in his other hand. It felt ridiculous. A toy against a monster. He thought of his mom. He thought of his unmade bed. He was going to die in a muddy hole in Oregon. The heavy splash of boots hitting the creek water echoed through the ravine. The man was less than 20 feet away. "I'm going to snap your neck," the man muttered, his voice dropping to a low, breathless growl as he waded through the water. He was searching, tearing at the brush. Tayson felt a sob building in his throat. He forced it down. The man's heavy footsteps moved closer to the uprooted tree. The wet gravel crunched under his weight. A shadow fell over the opening of the hollow. The man was standing right outside. Tayson stopped breathing. The girl beneath his hand went completely rigid. They could hear him breathing. Heavy, wet, raspy breaths. He was listening. Tayson braced himself. He angled the knife upward. If a hand came into the dark, he was going to stab it. It wouldn't stop the man, but it was all he had. 10 seconds passed. An eternity. Then the man turned. "Little rats!" He spat, his footsteps moving downstream, away from the hollow. He was following the creek. Tayson didn't move. He kept his hand over the girl's mouth. They stayed locked in that muddy hole, shaking, freezing, listening as the man's angry shouts faded down the ravine. The woods fell silent again. Only the sound of the dripping water and the rushing creek remained. The light was fading fast. The gray afternoon was turning into a bruised purple twilight. The temperature plummeted. Tayson pulled his hand away from the girl's mouth. She gasped, taking deep, shuddering breaths. "He's gone," Tayson whispered. She shook her head violently. "He'll come back." Tayson knew she was right. They couldn't stay here. The cold would kill them if the man didn't. His foot was completely numb. He crawled to the edge of the root system and peered out. The shadows were lengthening, turning the trees into dark, menacing silhouettes. "We have to move," Tayson said, turning back to her. "We have to follow the water." He grabbed her hand again. They crawled out of the hollow. The cold air hit them immediately, biting through their wet clothes. Tayson's teeth began to chatter. They moved slowly, keeping to the high bank, terrified of making a sound. The woods were pitching into true darkness. Tayson could barely see the ground in front of him. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shadow looked like a man in a denim jacket. They walked for what felt like hours. The terrain leveled out slightly, the steep ravine widening into a flatter valley. The trees began to thin. Tayson's legs were giving out. His lungs burned. The girl was leaning heavily against him, her steps dragging. Then the ground vibrated. Tayson stopped. He looked around wildly. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic pulsing thrum that traveled through the soles of his boots and his one bare foot straight into his bones. A low rumble echoed through the trees. It didn't belong in the forest. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't water. It was a mechanical growl, deep, throaty, and multiplying. The girl stopped beside him. Her head snapped up. For the first time, the look of sheer terror on her face vanished, replaced by something else. Recognition. The rumble grew louder, building into a deafening roar that shook the very air around them. Through the trees ahead, a beam of harsh, white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the mist. Then another, and another. Dozens of headlights pierced the night, moving fast along a hidden logging road just ahead. It sounded like a storm of thunder rolling directly toward them, the roar of over 100 V-twin engines running hot and aggressive, tearing up the mountain, unyielding and violently loud. Tayson stared at the lights, paralyzed. The girl squeezed his hand. Hard. "It's them," she whispered. The smell of hot exhaust and unburned hydrocarbons hit Tayson's throat, completely overriding the damp, rotting scent of the forest. It was sharp, industrial, and violent. The logging road, previously just a flat strip of darker black against the tree line, suddenly erupted into a blinding wall of halogen and LED light. Tayson threw his arm over his eyes. The physical force of the sound vibrated in his chest cavity. It wasn't a steady hum. It was an erratic, deafening chorus of heavy V-twin engines running at high RPMs, tires tearing at the loose gravel and wet dirt. Tayson instinctively took a step backward, his bare, frozen foot sinking into a patch of icy mud. Every survival instinct he had left screamed at him to run back into the woods. He had grown up in a quiet cul-de-sac where the loudest noise was a neighbor's lawnmower. The men riding these machines looked like the villains in the movies his mother wouldn't let him watch. Heavy leather, studded boots, matte black helmets, and chrome that reflected the harsh headlights like jagged lightning. He pulled on Caroline's hand. "No, wait, hide." She violently yanked her hand free. Her small, bruised fingers slipped from his grip. "Caroline, stop!" Tayson's voice was instantly swallowed by the roar of the engines. She didn't look back. She sprinted directly toward the blinding wall of lights, her bare feet kicking up wet gravel. She waved her arms frantically, a tiny, ragged silhouette against the blinding high beams. The lead rider slammed on his brakes. The heavy motorcycle fishtailed, the rear tire locking up and kicking a spray of mud and rocks into the ditch. The bike slid sideways, the rider expertly planting a heavy steel-toed boot into the dirt to keep the massive machine upright. Behind him, a chain reaction of squealing brakes and revving engines echoed down the road. Dozens of bikes halted in a chaotic, staggered formation, completely blocking the logging path. The lead rider didn't bother using the kickstand. He simply let the heavy Harley-Davidson drop to its side in the mud. He was a giant of a man, wide-shouldered and thick with muscle, wearing a battered leather vest over a flannel shirt. A red and white patch on his back flashed in the headlights, but Tayson couldn't read it. The man ripped his helmet off, dropping it onto the gravel, and sprinted toward the girl. "Caroline!" The voice was a raw, gravelly boom that cut cleanly through the rattling idle of 100 motorcycles. It sounded like it was torn straight out of the man's throat. "Daddy!" The giant man collided with the small girl. He dropped to his knees right there in the center of the muddy road, wrapping his massive tattooed arms around her frail body. He buried his face in her matted, dirt-caked hair. Tayson stood frozen at the edge of the tree line. He watched the man, Abby, rock back and forth, crushing his daughter to his chest. The giant biker's shoulders heaved. He was weeping. It was a harsh, ugly sound, guttural and desperate, completely at odds with the intimidating leather and the violent noise of the machines. All around them, the rest of the pack was dismounting. Men in heavy denim and scuffed leather cut off their engines. The sudden absence of the deafening roar left a ringing vacuum in Tayson's ears. Flashlights clicked on, harsh beams cutting through the misty air, scanning the tree line. Voices barked orders in the dark. "Set a perimeter. Keep the lights on the ridge. Doc, get up here now." A man with a gray beard and a canvas medic bag pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside Abby and Carolyn. Tayson suddenly felt overwhelmingly exposed. The adrenaline that had carried him out of the ravine evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. His left foot was completely numb. His right hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat, the cut on his thumb stinging fiercely. His clothes were soaked through, heavy and freezing against his skin. He began to shiver, not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking that locked his jaw and made his teeth grind together. He took a half step backward, intending to melt back into the shadows. He didn't belong here. He was an interloper in a deeply private, intensely overwhelming scene. A flashlight beam snapped onto him. The light was blinding, pinning him against the dark backdrop of the fir trees. "Hey, we got a kid over here!" a voice shouted. The cluster of men around Caroline shifted. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel, walking purposefully toward him. Tayson put his hands up to shield his eyes, terrified. He backed up until his shoulder hit the rough bark of a pine tree. He had nowhere left to go. The flashlight beam dropped toward the ground, illuminating Tayson's muddy, mismatched feet. One hiking boot, one filthy, torn wool sock. A shadow separated from the glare and stepped into Tayson's personal space. It wasn't the father. It was a younger man, his face half hidden by a thick black beard. He wore a heavy leather cut with the same winged death head patch taking up the entire back panel. The man didn't grab him, he just stopped, assessing the shivering, bleeding 12-year-old in the ripped scout jacket. "You're freezing, kid," the man said. His voice was surprisingly quiet. Before Tayson could answer, the man shrugged off his own heavy leather jacket. He stepped forward and draped it over Tayson's shoulders. The jacket weighed easily 10 pounds. It smelled like stale tobacco, old sweat, and gun oil. The thick leather instantly trapped what little body heat Tayson had left. "Come on," the biker said, placing a heavy, warm hand on Tayson's shoulder and guiding him out of the wet brush and onto the solid gravel of the road. They walked toward the center of the chaos. The medic was wrapping Caroline in a silver mylar thermal blanket. She was clinging to her father's neck like a monkey, refusing to let go, her face buried in his collar. Abby stood up, holding his daughter effortlessly against his chest. He turned, his eyes locked onto Tayson. The father's face was a map of hard miles and bad choices, deep lines etched around his eyes, a thick braided goatee, and a spiderweb tattoo crawling up the side of his neck. But his eyes were wet, entirely stripped of whatever toughness the rest of him projected. He walked over to Tyson. The surrounding bikers fell completely silent, parting to let their president through. The only sound was the cooling metal of the motorcycle engines ticking in the cold air. Abby stopped 2 feet away. He looked at Tyson. He looked at the oversized leather jacket swallowing the boy's frame, the blood drying on Tayson's hand, the missing shoe, and the terrified, exhausted look on his face. "You found her," Abby stated. It wasn't a question. Tayson swallowed hard. He nodded once. Abby shifted Caroline slightly, freeing his right hand. He didn't offer to shake. He reached out and placed his massive, calloused palm flat against the side of Tayson's face, right over his cheek. His hand was remarkably warm. "My name is Artie," the giant man said, his voice thick and wavering. "You saved my world, son. You hear me? You saved my whole world tonight." Tayson didn't know what to say. His lower lip quivered. The sheer intensity of the man's gratitude felt heavier than the leather jacket. He had her chained to a pipe," Tayson stammered out, his voice cracking. "In a shack, down there." The atmosphere on the road instantly changed. The emotional weight of the reunion vanished, sucked up into a sudden, suffocating vacuum. The air grew tense, volatile. Artie slowly pulled his hand away from Tayson's face. The grief and relief in his eyes hardened, crystallizing into something incredibly cold and terrifyingly sharp. He turned to the man who had given Tayson the jacket. "Gage, get my daughter and the boy on the truck. Get them to the clubhouse. Nobody leaves their side." "Done, boss," Gage said, stepping closer to Tayson. Artie turned back to Tayson, crouching down slightly so they were at eye level. The father was gone. The warlord was back. "The man who did this?" Artie asked, his voice now a low, even rumble. "Where is he?" Tayson pointed a shaking finger back toward the dark wall of trees. "Down the ravine. He followed the creek. He was big. He had a denim jacket and a big scar on his neck. Right here." Tayson traced a line from his ear to his collarbone. Artie didn't blink. He just stared at the woods. "He woke up," Tayson added, the panic rising in his chest as the memory flooded back. "He was chasing us. He said he was going to snap my neck." A collective low murmur rippled through the gathered crowd of men. It wasn't a murmur of fear. It was the sound of 100 men simultaneously deciding a man was going to die. Artie stood up slowly. He looked around the circle of his brothers. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to give a speech. "He's in the ravine," Artie said to the pack. "He's wearing denim. He has a scar on his neck." Men started walking toward their saddlebags. The sound of heavy metal shifting echoed in the damp air. Clack, clack. The unmistakable heavy racking of a pump-action shotgun. The sharp metallic snick of a large hunting knife being drawn from a leather sheath. Flashlights were adjusted, beams narrowing into focused, blinding spears of light. "We fan out at the creek," Artie commanded, his eyes locked on the black tree line. "Nobody calls the cops. Nobody calls an ambulance. We find him, and we end him." "Wait," Tayson blurted out, his voice small and pathetic in the face of the impending violence. Artie stopped and looked down at him. "What is it, son?" Tayson looked at the heavily armed men, then back to the dark woods. He knew he should be terrified of what these men were about to do. He was a Boy Scout. He was supposed to believe in the law, in the police, in doing things the right way. But he thought about the shack. He thought about the smell of ammonia, the heavy brass padlock, and the hollow, dead look in Caroline's eyes before he cut her free. He thought about the man's boots crashing through the creek, hunting them like animals. Tayson looked at Artie. He didn't ask them to stop. "He's got a gun," Tayson lied. The man hadn't had a gun that Tayson saw, but he wanted them to be careful. He wanted them to win. Artie offered a grim, humorless smile. "We got more." Artie turned his back, racking the slide of a heavy 1911 pistol, and walked straight into the blackberry brambles. Behind him, 80 heavily armed men in leather and denim marched off the gravel and disappeared into the dark, wet maw of the forest. The beams of their flashlights danced wildly through the trees, a swarm of angry electric fireflies descending into the ravine. Gage placed a hand on Tayson's shoulder. "Come on, kid," Gage said softly, leading Tayson away from the tree line toward a black heavy-duty pickup truck idling behind the wall of motorcycles. "Show's over for you. You did your job." Tayson let himself be led away. He climbed into the heated cab of the truck, the heavy leather jacket pooling around him in the passenger seat. Caroline was in the back, wrapped in the silver blanket, staring blankly out the window. Tayson looked out through the windshield. The logging road was empty of men, leaving only the silent chrome machines reflecting the ambient light. From deep within the woods, far down in the dark ravine, the hunting dogs were loose. Tayson closed his eyes, pulled his numb foot up onto the seat, and finally let himself cry. The heater in the cab of the Ford F-250 blasted on high, smelling of melting dust and scorched plastic. It didn't warm Tayson's bones. The shivering had moved deeper, settling into the core of his chest. He sat rigidly in the passenger seat, drowning in the heavy leather cut Gage had draped over him. Every time the truck hit a pothole on the winding descent out of the foothills, the seatbelt locked, pressing the rigid leather against his bruised collarbone. He didn't look out the window. He kept his eyes fixed on the illuminated dials of the dashboard. The green glow of the speedometer was the only thing making sense right now. In the back seat, Caroline hadn't made a sound. Gage drove in complete silence, one massive hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark tree lines through the windshield. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the mud tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic squeaking wipers pushing drizzle off the glass. They hit the city limits an hour later. The transition from the oppressive ancient dark of the woods to the stark buzzing sodium lights of the industrial district was jarring. Gage pulled the truck down a dead-end street lined with chain-link fences and corrugated metal warehouses. He stopped in front of a heavy, windowless cinder-block building. There was no sign. Just a single security camera perched above a reinforced steel door and 3 rows of empty motorcycle parking spaces. Gage killed the engine. He turned around, looking into the back seat. "We're here, little bird. You're safe now." He got out, walked around, and opened the rear door, scooping Caroline up, mylar blanket and all. Tayson fumbled with his door handle with his left hand, protecting his sliced right thumb, which had swollen and throbbed with a dull, hot ache. He stepped out onto the wet concrete. His bare foot instantly registered the sharp bite of a tiny piece of broken glass, but he didn't care. He limped after Gage. The inside of the clubhouse didn't look like a criminal underworld. It looked like a failing VFW hall. The air smelled of stale beer, heavy bleach, and old cigarette smoke permanently baked into the drywall. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed angrily overhead, casting a sickly pale wash over a battered pool table, a long mahogany bar scarred with burn marks, and mismatched leather couches duct-taped at the seams. A woman in tight jeans and a faded black tank top came rushing out from a back hallway. She had bleach blonde hair showing dark roots and a sleeve of colorful, chaotic tattoos. "Oh, Jesus! Oh, baby!" she gasped, practically tearing Caroline out of Gage's arms. "Roxanne, get her in the back. Draw a hot bath. Throw those clothes in the incinerator," Gage ordered, his voice flat and authoritative. "Don't leave her." Roxanne nodded frantically, burying her face against Caroline's dirty hair, and carried the girl away. Caroline's eyes met Tayson's just before she disappeared down the hall. The hollow, dead stare from the shack was gone. She didn't look happy, but she looked present. "Sit," Gage told Tayson, pointing to a heavy wooden stool at the bar. Tayson climbed onto it. He felt ridiculous. He was a middle schooler sitting at a biker bar, wearing one shoe and a gang vest that weighed more than his backpack. The gray-bearded medic from the woods, Doc, emerged from behind the bar carrying a metal first aid box. He didn't ask how Tayson was feeling. He just grabbed Tayson's right hand, flipped it over, and inspected the cut on his thumb. "Sloppy," Doc grunted. "Knife?" "Yeah," Tayson whispered. Cutting the zip tie, Doc uncapped a bottle of brown liquid. This is iodine. It's going to suck. He poured it directly into the open wound. Tayson inhaled sharply through his teeth, his entire arm jerking instinctively, but Doc's grip was like an iron vise. The burn was spectacular, a searing, white-hot pain that actually cut through the lingering shock. Doc quickly packed it with gauze and wrapped it tight with white athletic tape. "Foot!" Doc demanded. Tayson lifted his bare, muddy foot. Doc wiped away the freezing mud with a warm, damp bar towel. The skin was scraped raw, purple, and dead-looking at the toes. "You're lucky," Doc muttered, applying a thick layer of antiseptic ointment. "Another hour out there, you'd be losing toes to frostbite." He wrapped the foot in thick bandages and tossed Tayson a pair of heavy gray wool socks. "Put 'em on, both of 'em." Gage walked behind the bar. He didn't pour a drink. He grabbed a glass, filled it with ice from a plastic bin, and popped the top off a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward Tayson. "Drink it," Gage said. "Sugar helps the shock." Tayson grabbed the glass with his good hand. The cold condensation felt grounding. He took a sip. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He sat there, the frantic energy of the night finally collapsing under the weight of utter exhaustion. He thought about Scoutmaster Hayes. Hayes would have yelled at him. Hayes would have given him a lecture on the buddy system, blew his whistle, and made a huge, embarrassing scene. Gage didn't yell. Gage just watched the front door, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting. "Are they—" Tayson started to ask, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "Are they going to kill him?" Doc stopped packing his kit. Gage didn't look away from the steel door. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, filled only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rattling of the ice maker behind the bar. "Your job is done, kid," Gage finally said, his tone offering zero room for negotiation. "Drink your Coke." Time warped. Tayson didn't know if he sat at the bar for 30 minutes or 3 hours. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow to the back of the head. His eyelids felt like they were filled with wet sand. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cool mahogany of the bar, slipping into a fractured, twilight sleep where the smell of ammonia kept jerking him awake. Then the vibration returned. It started in the floorboards, a low, distant rumble that slowly amplified, rattling the bottles of cheap whiskey on the shelves. Tayson sat up, rubbing his eyes. Outside, the chaotic roar of earlier was gone. This was different. The engine sounded sluggish, running low and heavy as they pulled into the lot. The sharp crackle of gravel under tires, the heavy thuds of kickstands hitting the pavement, the metallic clicks of ignitions turning off. Nobody spoke. The heavy steel door swung open. The cold night air rolled into the stale warmth of the clubhouse. The men walked in. They didn't look like heroes returning from a rescue mission. They looked like gravediggers. Their leather was slick with rain and mud. Their faces were grim, drawn tight. They moved quietly, filtering toward the bar, stripping off heavy gloves and tossing them onto tables. Nobody ordered a drink. Nobody cheered. The silence was thick, oppressive, and stained with something metallic that Tayson couldn't quite place until the third man walked past him. It was copper, fresh dirt and copper. Artie walked in last. The giant man looked distinctly different than he had on the logging road. The frantic, weeping father was entirely submerged. His heavy boots left thick clumps of dark, wet soil on the linoleum floor. His knuckles were raw. The skin split across his right hand, seeping sluggishly. A dark, jagged smear stained the thigh of his faded denim jeans. It wasn't mud. It was too dark, too wet. Artie didn't look at anyone. He walked straight past the pool table, behind the bar, and turned on the small stainless steel sink used for washing glasses. He pumped coarse orange soap into his massive hands. The sound of his palms aggressively scrubbing together was the only noise in the room. He washed his hands for a long time. He scrubbed his knuckles, his forearms, digging his fingernails under each other. The water running down the drain turned a pale, rusty pink before it finally ran clear. He grabbed a paper towel, dried his hands, and tossed it into a bin. He let out a long, ragged exhale, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the liquor bottles. Then he turned to Tayson. Artie walked over and stopped in front of the boy. The president of the MC looked incredibly old in the harsh fluorescent light. "She asleep?" Artie asked Gage without looking at him. "Yeah, boss. Roxanne's in the chair next to the bed," Gage replied quietly. Artie nodded. He looked down at Tayson. He noted the bandaged thumb, the thick wool socks over the bandaged foot, and the empty Coke glass. "You're a brave kid, Tayson," Artie said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It lacked the emotional pitch of the logging road, replaced by a hollow, terrifying calm. "Most grown men would have run the other way. You didn't." Tayson swallowed. He looked at the dark stain on Artie's jeans, then quickly dragged his eyes back up to the man's face. "Is he—" Tayson couldn't finish the sentence. Artie didn't blink. He leaned in slightly, resting his massive forearms on the bar top. "The woods are deep around here, son," Artie said slowly, his eyes boring into Tayson's. "A lot of old mine shafts. A lot of deep ravines where the mud slides. Sometimes people wander out there and they just get lost. They slip. They fall. The forest just swallows them up." Tayson stared back. He understood. He was 12, but he wasn't stupid. The man in the shack wasn't going to jail. There would be no trial, no police sketches. The monster was gone, buried under roots and rocks, erased from the earth by 100 angry fathers. Tayson felt a sudden, profound wave of relief. It felt wrong, heavy, and complicated, but it was there. He wouldn't have to look over his shoulder. He wouldn't have to testify in a sterile courtroom. "Understand?" Artie asked softly. Tayson nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Good." Artie reached out and squeezed Tayson's shoulder. It was a heavy, affirming pressure. "Now, we got a problem. You've got a troop and a family freaking out right now. And we can't have the state police knocking on this door asking questions about where we found you." Artie turned to Doc. "You got his foot taped up good?" "Good enough to walk to a cruiser," Doc said. Artie turned back to Tayson. He outlined the lie with meticulous, practiced precision. "Here's the story," Artie said, his tone shifting into something instructional. "You got lost. You wandered off the trail. You fell down a ravine, busted your foot, lost your boot. You crawled up to a logging road and you kept walking until you saw headlights. We were coming back from a run. We saw you on the side of the road, picked you up, brought you here, and called the cops." Artie tapped a heavy finger against the bar. "You never saw a shack. You never saw a man in a denim jacket, and you absolutely never saw my daughter. As far as you know, you're the only person who got lost in those woods tonight. We clear?" Tayson processed the story. It was clean. It explained his injuries. It removed Caroline completely. "What about her?" Tayson asked, his voice tight. "When she goes home, won't she tell them?" Artie's jaw tightened. "She won't talk to the cops, and if they ask her mother will tell them she was at her aunt's house for the weekend. Nobody reported her missing yet. The man who took her—" Artie paused, a dangerous shadow crossing his face. "He took her from her mother's front yard 4 hours ago. We found out before the cops did. We handle our own." He reached out and tapped the winged death head patch on the leather cut Tayson was still wearing. "Take the cut off, kid. Gage is going to drive you to a gas station 2 miles from the command center they set up for you. He'll call 911 from a payphone. Wait until he sees the cruisers, and then he's gone." Tayson slipped out of the heavy leather jacket. Without it, the VFW hall felt instantly colder. He handed it to Gage. Artie stepped back. "You did a good thing today, Tayson. A real good thing. But tomorrow you go back to being a kid. You forget this place. You forget me." Tayson slid off the bar stool. His bandaged foot hit the floor, and a sharp spike of pain reminded him of the reality of the last 4 hours. He looked at the room full of bikers, men with criminal records, men who had just committed an unspeakable act of violence in the dark. He didn't feel afraid of them. He felt a strange, terrifying respect. "I won't forget," Tayson said quietly. Artie looked at him for a long moment. A ghost of a smile, sad and exhausted, touched the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," Artie muttered, turning away toward the hallway where his daughter was sleeping. "I suppose you won't." Gage didn't take him all the way to the police perimeter. He killed the truck's headlights 2 blocks away from a 24-hour diner on the edge of the state highway. The rain had picked up again, drumming a heavy, relentless beat against the roof of the cab. Through the rain-slicked windshield, the glowing neon sign of the diner bled into the black asphalt like a spilled cherry slushy. Gage put the truck in park. He reached into the center console and pulled out a cheap plastic flip phone. He cracked the window, tossed the phone out into a deep puddle, and then turned to Tayson. "There's a payphone on the side of that diner. One of the few left in this county," Gage said, his voice flat and devoid of the earlier protective warmth. "You walk over there. You dial 911. You tell them you saw the lights from the highway and walk toward them. You sit on the curb and you wait." Tayson looked at the glowing diner. It looked like an alien spaceship sitting in the dark expanse of the rural highway. "Do you remember the story?" Gage asked. "I got lost," Tayson recited, staring straight ahead. "I fell down a ravine. I followed the creek, found a logging road, and walked until I hit the highway. Nobody picked me up. Nobody brought me here." Gage studied him for a long moment. He reached across the cab and pushed the heavy passenger door open. The cold, wet wind immediately whipped into the heated cab, biting at Tayson's exposed neck. "Walk straight," Gage said. "Don't look back at the truck." Tayson slid out of the seat. His bandaged foot hit the wet pavement, the thick wool socks soaking through instantly. He shut the door with his good hand. True to Gage's order, he didn't turn around. He put his head down against the driving rain and limped toward the neon glow. Behind him, the heavy diesel engine rumbled, shifted into gear, and faded away down the dark 2-lane road. The payphone receiver was freezing plastic against his ear. The 911 operator's voice was sharp, professional, and jarringly normal. Tayson gave his name. He told her where he was. He hung up. He slid down the brick wall of the diner and sat on the wet concrete curb. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins to stop the violent shivering. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating ache in his stomach and a throbbing fire in his sliced thumb. It took less than 4 minutes. The wail of the sirens hit him before the lights did. 3 state trooper cruisers came tearing off the highway, their tires squealing on the wet asphalt. Red and blue strobes violently fractured the darkness, painting the diner, the parking lot, and Tayson in harsh, frantic bursts of color. Doors slammed. Heavy duty belts jingled. Flashlights pinned him against the brick wall. "Kid! Hey kid, don't move!" A trooper was on his knees in front of Tayson in seconds. The man smelled of stale black coffee, wet polyester, and spearmint gum. He was talking fast into a shoulder radio, his hands patting Tayson down, checking for broken bones. "Dispatch, we have him. I need EMTs at the Route 9 diner. Step on it. He's freezing." The next hour was a chaotic blur of sensory overload. The back of an ambulance, the sharp smell of rubbing alcohol, a paramedic cutting the ruined, muddy wool socks off his foot with trauma shears, the agonizing prick of an IV needle going into the back of his hand. Then the hospital doors blew open. His mother didn't walk into the ER bay. She collapsed into it. She was still wearing the clothes she had on when she dropped him off at the scout meeting, yoga pants and an oversized sweater, now soaked through with rain. Her face was gray, puffy, and completely stripped of its usual suburban composure. "Tayson." She hit the side of the gurney, burying her face into his chest, completely ignoring the IV line and the monitors. She was sobbing, a frantic, hyperventilating sound that made Tayson's own throat tight. She smelled like lavender lotion in sheer, unadulterated panic. His older brother stood in the doorway, pale and silent, for once completely devoid of a sarcastic comment. "I'm okay, Mom," Tayson whispered, awkwardly patting her back with his bandaged right hand. "I'm okay." A state police detective in a damp suit pulled up a chair next to the gurney 10 minutes later. He had a notebook and a tired, empathetic smile. "You gave everyone a real scare, Tayson," the detective said gently. "Can you walk me through what happened? Take your time." Tayson looked at the detective. He looked at his mother, who was clutching his left hand with a grip that threatened to break his fingers. Tayson thought about the shack. He thought about the smell of ammonia, the heavy brass padlock, and the dead look in Caroline's eyes. He thought about Artie washing his bloody hands in the stainless steel sink, the water running a pale, rusty pink. Tayson looked down at the crisp white hospital sheets. He let his lower lip tremble. It wasn't entirely an act. The exhaustion was bone deep, and the urge to cry was very real. "I had to pee," Tayson said, his voice cracking perfectly. "I walked off the trail. Everything looked the same. I couldn't find the path. I started running, and then the ground just fell." He told the lie. He built it piece by piece, leaning into the hesitations and the tears, letting the trauma of the actual event bleed into the fabricated story. He told them about the mud, the cold, and the terrifying darkness. He told them he walked until he saw the highway lights. The detective stopped writing. He offered a sympathetic nod, completely buying the narrative. Why wouldn't he? It was the logical, predictable tragedy of a boy lost in the woods. Tayson was 12. He was supposed to be a victim of the elements, not a witness to a murder. "You did great, son," the detective said, closing his notebook. "You kept moving. You saved your own life." Tayson nodded slowly, staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. He hadn't saved his own life, but he had saved someone else's, and the price for that was carrying a ghost story he could never tell. 3 months later, the physical remnants of the woods had mostly vanished. The frostbite on his toes had peeled away, leaving behind sensitive pink skin that ached only when the weather turned cold. The deep slice on his thumb had healed into a raised silver crescent moon scar. He had quit Troop 44 the week he got out of the hospital. His mother, fully traumatized by the ordeal, didn't argue. It was a Tuesday in early September. The suffocating heat of late summer hung over the cul-de-sac. Tayson sat on his front porch, mindlessly spinning the wheels of a skateboard he had no intention of riding. Life had snapped back to a horrifyingly banal routine. School had started. His brother went back to ignoring him. His mother went back to complaining about property taxes and the neighbor's lawn. The world around him spun on a predictable axis, completely ignorant of the violence bleeding into the dirt just a few miles away in the Cascade foothills. Tayson felt disconnected from all of it. He sat in his middle school math class, listening to kids complain about homework, and all he could hear was the metallic clink, drag of a dog chain on a rusted pipe. He couldn't sleep with the bedroom door closed. He couldn't tolerate the smell of bleach or heavy household cleaners. He was a 12-year-old boy carrying a man's secret, and it felt like a lead weight sitting squarely on his chest. He had checked the local news every day for a month. There were no reports of a body found in the woods. There were no reports of a missing girl named Caroline. Artie's machine was terrifyingly efficient. The man with the scar had simply ceased to exist. A heavy matte black delivery van turned onto the cul-de-sac, breaking the suburban silence. It wasn't FedEx or UPS. It was unmarked, coated in a layer of highway dust. The van idled in front of Tayson's house. A man stepped out. He was wearing jeans, work boots, and a plain black t-shirt. He had a thick dark beard and a spiderweb tattoo peeking out from the collar of his shirt. It wasn't Gage, and it wasn't Artie, but Tayson recognized the posture, the rigid, heavy way he carried himself. Tayson stopped spinning the skateboard wheel. His heart kicked up a notch. The man didn't look at Tayson. He didn't wave. He simply walked up the driveway, dropped a small brown padded envelope into the metal mailbox at the curb, turned around, and got back into the van. The engine revved low, and the van rolled away, disappearing around the corner. Tayson waited 2 full minutes, his eyes scanning the empty street, before he walked down the driveway. He opened the mailbox. The envelope was heavy. There was no return address, no stamps, just his name, Tayson, written in thick black Sharpie across the front. He carried it up to his bedroom and locked the door. He sat on the edge of his bed, his thumb tracing the silver scar on his right hand, before he tore the paper open. Inside was a small, meticulously crafted wooden box. Tayson flipped the brass latch and opened it. Resting on a bed of dark crushed velvet was a folding knife. It wasn't a cheap, faux bone scout knife. It was a heavy, custom forged piece of Damascus steel. The handle was genuine, polished stag antler secured with hammered brass pins. The craftsmanship was stunning. It was a tool built for survival, designed to cut through anything. Tayson carefully lifted it from the box. The weight of it in his palm felt grounding. It felt permanent. Tucked underneath the velvet inlay was a single small piece of heavy cardstock. There was no letter, no elaborate thank you. Just a single word stamped in black ink, accompanied by a small winged skull insignia no larger than a dime. Brother. Tayson stared at the card. The tight, suffocating knot that had been sitting in his chest for 3 months slowly began to unravel. He wasn't crazy. It hadn't been a nightmare. The woods were dark, and there were monsters in them, but there were also men who hunted the monsters. He didn't belong to their world. He would never ride with them, never wear their patch, and never see Caroline again. But as he snapped the heavy Damascus blade open, the sound a clean, sharp click echoing in the quiet suburban bedroom, Tayson knew he would never just be a boy playing in the woods again. He closed the knife, slipped it deep into his pocket, and went downstairs to eat dinner. The woods didn't stand a chance against the roar of 127 heavy engines, and neither did the man hiding in them. What started as a terrifying nightmare for a 12-year-old scout turned into a brutal lesson in loyalty, brotherhood, and the lengths a father will go to get his daughter back. If this gritty story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who loves a tense thriller, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep, immersive stories delivered straight to your feed.